North Korea might just be one of the most hated countries on the planet. I would say they're quite isolated. And they go about things in a very sort of weird way. They have just loaned, donated thousands of troops to Putin to be used in the war with Ukraine. What the hell is going on?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's been dominating some of the headlines this week. By the way, good morning, Bern. I just get that.
Did I say that?
No, you didn't. I'm mortified. Because all of a sudden, North Korea, isolated country, desperately needs currency, desperately needs technology. All of a sudden now, Russia desperately needs ammunition and desperately needs troops. It's been fighting for over 2 years in Ukraine, lost a lot of people, doesn't want to do another round of mobilization, has brought in loads and loads of mercenaries, but the supplies of those are tailing off, has tried using criminals. Prisoners starting to recognize that actually it's probably safer in a prison than it is actually on the front line at the moment.
Yeah.
And therefore, this seems to be a marriage made in heaven. And we understand that between 1,500 and 3,000 North Korean troops have now gone to Russia, potentially up to 12,000 reports suggest. The real question for me, though, is how are they going to be used? Because they could be used on the front line. The trouble is they don't speak the language. There's going to be a real language issue. They have no experience. And all of a sudden, that starts to flirt with international law.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Or do they get used to do more mundane jobs in Russia and free up Russian troops to go to the front line?
And you said they don't have much experience. What I took that to mean is, in terms of being battle ready, who knows?
Well, for the last few years, but they haven't been fighting for the last few. What they have been is a very authoritarian state that doesn't allow them to think at all. So they will almost certainly not have delegated command. They are just do what they're told. So who tells them what to do? Are they now going to be told what to do by the Russians? I'm not sure they'll be completely happy with that. There's talks about, will they run away? Will they flee? Will they defect?
Yeah.
Well, we also heard rumours that the families of these people who are being deployed have all been corralled together.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That is vicious.
And you sort of go, well, that's really sinister, isn't it? Really sinister. So I'm not quite sure the dynamics of all this. It's a really worrying. Now, Russia and North Korea both say nothing to see here. But there does seem to be a lot of evidence piling up that North Koreans have gone into Russia and are doing training.
So they're going to have senior people there who are bilingual at least, so they can take the orders and give the orders in North Korean.
Well, yeah, but it's also about how a lot of military, because they trained, they know processes, they know procedures, they know how you do ground assaults, how you do, and Russia's adapted quite a lot over the last couple of years in response to the war, the actual circumstances on the ground. North Korea will have none of that. So it's, and of course, again, it raises all sorts of really interesting questions, not least of which, if Russia can use another country's military in the war, then effectively North Korea is joining the war, aren't they?
Yeah, and maybe the West will say, well, if you can do it, we can do it.
Yeah, so I think that there's that side of it. And there's also the side of it, does that mean that North Korea is now a target for Ukraine?
Yeah.
Because they're now involved in the war.
Yeah.
And if North Korea can join it, President Putin's been trying very hard to stop the West getting involved in the war in Ukraine and said, if this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's nothing to do with you, West. If he now pulls North Koreans in, surely that opens the door for the West to do that.
Yeah. It opens up another issue, doesn't it, which is related to BRICS, which we'll cover on another occasion. But it's, BRICS is a developing story. Having been isolated, North Korea now has, and we've seen some of that already, but they're definitely doing this. They've definitely made a friend of Russia. Russia's got new friends internationally from a geopolitical point of view. So maybe that gets North Korea into a wider network of relationships as well. So this could have a long tail.
I absolutely agree. I mean, for many years, the strategy about managing North Korea is to keep it isolated from everybody. Now, as you say, it's got friends, not only in Russia, but it's now being involved in a much bigger community. And by providing troops, what will North Korea be getting in return?
Yeah.
because they know they've got Russia who desperately needs something. Russia's got lots of money, just doesn't have the troops. North Korea's got lots of troops, but doesn't have the money. Yeah. All of a sudden now, that money can now start to service North Korea's nuclear program.
Yeah.
There are just so many things here that, where NATO was always seen as a defensive alliance, and you had individual countries like Russia, like Iran, or now, as they start to coalesce, we call it an axis of evil, but this is providing a greater opportunity for those countries to operate together, and that will create an emboldened North Korea. That has to be a worry. That has to be destabilizing for the global security environment.
And actually what they're doing is trading. I mean, it's war, but they're trading. And what that could do is open up other trading relationships for North Korea, which we may or may not like from a economic competition point of view.
No, and I like the trading analogy, except when it comes to lives.
Yeah, quite.
And because as soon as now, imagine...
They don't care, do they?
No. And that's the thing, Kim Jong-un is not...
They don't have your heart, Sean.
No, but it's playing with lives again, isn't it?
Of course it is, yeah.
And it just shows the start. Russia's been pouring manpower at this, doesn't care it's a meat grinder. Now you've got a North Korean leader. Everybody who sent troops into that environment, whether it be mercenaries, whether it be Russia or whatever, have lost a lot of soldiers.
Yeah.
So North Korea will know they're going to lose a lot of soldiers. What do you tell the families? What do you tell... Do you ask the soldiers if they want to go?
No.
Do you tell them and they're dying for the greater good of North Korea?
Well, you don't have to tell them anything. Just give them an order, Sean.
Yeah, but
it's not Great Britain.
No, I know, but that is they become pawns, don't they? They become pawns in a much bigger global game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're not, your heart is too big to run North Korea, Sean. So, but talking about heart, so in a second we're going to talk about this offer, a couple of billion, that the UK has made to Ukraine. But before we do that, just watch this film for a few seconds. So, Sean, what's the first emotion you feel when you watch this film?
You showed this to me the other evening, and I couldn't quite work out why you were doing it. But actually, it is quite clever because it is a rousing anthem. It evokes passion in you. And I felt a slight conflict of emotions.
Yeah, me too.
But what was the motive?
Well, I've always thought that, I'm definitely going to get hit for saying this. The Russian national anthem is, for me, with maybe America coming a close second, it's not very patriotic, is it? Is the best anthem, the most emotional, rousing anthem in the entire world. And there you've got a picture of what I presume are very proud, big-hearted people. And the Russian people are very proud, a long history of it, like the Ukrainians. And it's sad to me, and I felt emotional when I watched it. I love listening to it. It was just sad that you've got these very proud people, obviously, completely passionate, through the singing of things like this song. And yet they've been driven to war, which probably most of them never wanted, by a maniac. And that is sad.
I think there's plus ça change. If you look back through history, people generally don't want to go to war. It's the masters that do. And I think the British military always used to go into battle with bands playing. Why? Because they didn't have a weapon in their hand. They had a musical instrument in their hand. They had it because it's rousing. It arouses passion. It rouses pride. It rouses a whole lot of sensations.
National sense. Identity, definitely.
And even though it's not, as you say, the Russian people have suffered a huge loss as a result of their rampage into Ukraine.
Yeah.
And yet still, like you, it touches...
Gets you, yeah. Well, I hope people appreciated that little interlude.
I hope they don't misunderstand. We're not saying for 1 minute we support Russia, but it It's something about the national anthems.
I think you can love the Russian people and hate the war and have feelings about Putin, which are different.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the UK loan then. So the UK are going to loan £2 billion, euros, dollars to Ukraine for the war effort.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's $2.26 billion, which I think probably equates to about £2 billion. One of the things people say about, well, Ukraine doesn't need money, it needs military hardware. I don't want to keep saying this, but when I was in Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago, the shops are full. There is no shortage of supply lines into Ukraine. There's a shortage of money. The economy is not as buoyant as it is here.
Money for the people.
For the people, and therefore they can buy stuff. And therefore, if you can provide Ukraine with money, it can then go out. Yes, it can't necessarily go and buy a long-range missile, but we were finding even things like flight suits, bullets. Bullets are available, but the government hasn't got enough money to provide them. So lots of people are buying them on the market, sending them through to the front line. So money has a huge value. 2 billion. What was interesting about this one is the British government said, but Ukraine is never going to repay a penny.
They actually said a penny, did they? Because they could repay in other ways. So there could be the small print.
It could be, but and there's lots of caveats to this, but I think what's interesting about this announcement is that, remember the frozen assets, that the West has frozen Russian assets.
The interest from them.
And what it's saying is that legally it might be difficult to take those assets and give them to Ukraine, but you can take the interest on those assets. And therefore, if you've got those assets invested and you use the interest, that can be used to service a loan. And so the West has come up with lots of different ways. And apparently there's about $50 billion worth of potential loans that can be given out through that mechanism.
Yeah.
So I think what I love about it is it's a very imaginative way of getting Russia to pay for its adventures in Ukraine.
Yes.
So we provide money directly to President Zelenskyy. Yeah. It's a bit more complicated than that.
There's some other shades in this, isn't there, if you dig into it? The first is, how do you actually give money from one country to another? You go, just give me a sort code and account number, please. Actually, it's a lot harder than people might think. So that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is, in my opinion, is that money will be given to UK defence manufacturers, which is very good for the UK economy. So what Sir Keir Starmer is doing, he's taking money from Russia through the interest on these frozen assets. He's taking that money from Russia and he's giving it to the UK economy. They'll then make extra war machinery, which they will then donate to Ukraine. What the deal is then about repayment, who knows? So there are layers of complexity, rather like the Russian dolls. The more you open them, the more you find,
No, I agree. And there was an interesting announcement this week, wasn't there, about Rheinmetall. Apparently, there's a big deal being done between Germany and Pistorius and our Defence Secretary John Healey that was close collaboration with Germany. And one of those announcements was Rheinmetall setting up a factory in the UK to produce artillery barrels, 400 jobs, and they're also using British steel. Now,
British steel, there isn't such a thing anymore.
Well, you thought so, but not a company, but steel made in England. I think it's called Sheffield steel, I think, because there's a particular style of steel. I'm not an expert in steel, but that was an example. It was tucked away in the small print, but you went, I wonder if all of this is tied together, that actually we're going to provide $2 billion, but Rheinmetall, all we actually want to use is provide barrels, but we're not going to give you the money in Germany. Yeah. So if you were to set up a factory in the UK, that's a mechanism by which we might, I don't know.
But that's why we've got 2 ears, Sean.
Yeah.
The left ear listens to what the politician was saying. The right ear is listening to what he's not saying.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we've been talking about this podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not about, none of us know what the truth is, but it's trying to
it's fun trying to find out.
What's actually going on.
Quite. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something else is shocking that you may not have heard. So Putin the idea from the West was to beat Putin up, to isolate him, all in concert. All the Western leaders stood up at a podium and said, we're going to isolate Russia. Not sure it's happened quite in the way they suggested. Maybe that's another topic. However, what Putin has now turned around and said, well, if you can freeze my assets in your country, I can freeze your assets in my country. And that's what he's doing. And there's a big furore about it, because obviously there's a lot of money flying around, which he now is saying, well, I'm going to do the same thing to you. So there's a bit of tit for tat going on.
There is, I think, that's another example of getting behind the news, isn't it, though? I mean, in big handfuls, Russia generates a huge amount of money from oil and gas revenues. So it's relatively cash rich, a bit like the Arab states. And they look at all this money piling up in there going, what are we going to do with this? So they look to invest it around the world. And therefore have considerable assets based all over the world. And it's been a worry, hasn't it? We can get into it another day about football clubs being bought and big properties being bought or whatever. If you look at UK assets overseas, we don't generally generate a lot of cash, do we? We struggle to generate a balance of payments with the rest of the world. We don't have a natural resource that we can sell. So we don't generally have huge investments that of cash have been bought around the world. We have legacy money, but not that much new money. So whilst it's absolutely right what you say, I was speaking to a company this week that has had to rapidly withdraw from Russia. And there's been lots of high-profile withdrawals. They can't rip down their real estate. They can't bring all their tooling back. They've lost a huge amount of money doing that. And Russia effectively gets a free factory, free workers. Yeah, they may not have the IP, but they're benefiting. And that is something I think that's deeply uncomfortable. But some companies have made it, like Coca-Cola, we're not going to operate in Russia anymore. Some companies have said, no, we're going to continue.
Yeah. Well, do you know where Russia puts its money to keep it safe so it doesn't get taken, frozen by quotes to the West? Given we've got an expanding network from BRICS, I think it's another 6 countries have joined BRICS to make it 11 from the initial 5. And they will all provide new banking systems. They've got their own SWIFT network now running for trading, for inter-nation trading, so they don't have to use the West SWIFT system. So I suspect Putin will also be finding other ways to deposit money, which makes it safe. But this is going to be a developing story, isn't it?
Massively, and it intrigues me only because tip of the iceberg, and we will do it another time. But who owns the assets in this country? When you were a businessman, when you want to go to the markets to borrow money, it's still up. But when you go to the markets to get money to fund it, where does that money come from? Who has spare money these days? And a lot of that money is coming from places outside the country because they want to invest. Yeah,
quite. Yeah.
Do we do the same sort of check?
It's very difficult to find out originally where the money actually comes from.
No, exactly.
So I get an investor, private equity, put money into one of my companies. I never, it's very hard sometimes to find out, despite what they say, where its ultimate sources.
Yeah.
Talking about money, and lots of it, there's been a lot of rumours, maybe sordid rumours, that like many leaders of nations in conflict, with a lot of money swirling around, Zelenskyy has made himself really wealthy, i.e. a billionaire. I don't want to believe it, but I think you've done some digging, haven't you, Sean?
Yeah, because I saw these same sort of things, and Ukraine admits itself that there's a rife with the corruption, and therefore, if you get to a leadership position, people are making a lot of money. And there were some social media stories running around of this over $1 billion. Now, clearly, if it was true, that's deeply concerning because Ukraine is at war. All the money should be trying to be fed to the front line. And all of this was potentially very damaging for President Zelenskyy. Forbes, they're not the experts, but they do pretty forensic looks around people's wealth and whatever, had looked into this because Zelenskyy was meant to have multi-million properties in the US, multi-billion enterprises outside the country with big yachts.
And his wife as well, yeah.
And his wife. And the Forbes could find no evidence whatsoever of this. Is Zelenskyy a wealthy man? Yes. Did they find out that he was worth about, I think it's $20 million was the most they reckon he's worth. Now, to you and I, that's still very wealthy. To most Ukrainians, that's a huge amount of money. But actually, it is worth remembering, there's been a program on BBC for the last running about his background. He was a very successful comedian. He got involved in a couple of production companies. He even famously performed in front of Putin and took the mickey out of him, and you see Putin laughing. But
that was the reason.
I've got your card marked, mate. And he's got, I think it's a 25% stake in Kvartal 95, which is one of the media companies. So there does appear to be enough credibility around the fact that he made his money before the start of the war.
So tens of millions, not billions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there does seem to be a very reasonable, proper... Now, do we know what the truth is? No, we don't. Mm-hmm. But the rhetoric, which is deliberately appears to be to try and undermine his position in a country that's... He's the leader, he's siphoning off money, you shouldn't trust him, Ukrainians. Well, they may not trust him because he's wealthy. We all are a bit bitter about people who are wealthy for some bizarre reason, even in this country. But he is not a billionaire. Pretty confident of that.
Okay, well, I'm pretty loyal when there's two sides to a fight and I'm on one side rather than the other. So I choose not to believe it. But there was another rumor that says his bags were actually packed ready. So if there was a problem and he was likely to get taken, then he'd be off. He'd got his exit.
And if that was true, and I'm using my finger, if that was true, do you remember? I'm trying to think when the story was that the US offered a way out for him, and he said, "I don't need a taxi. I need military support."
Yeah.
And he made very clear that he was staying. I think it was when the Russians first did the attack, and they were clearly trying to take the capital, Kyiv. Kostabel, the airfield, was the first place to attack, and the Americans offered a route out for him, and he said, "I don't need a route out. I need you to help me."
Yeah.
And ever since then, we haven't seen him in a suit. We've seen him in his combat fatigues.
All credit then.
And now, again, I don't know, but all of it points towards the fact that he's there with his fellow countrymen, and he's not for running away. And I'm pretty confident that I'm amazed his wife appears to have stayed in Kyiv. Yeah. But my only caveat to that is, having been to Kyiv a week or so ago, most of the capital feels just like a normal city.
Yeah.
So...
Well, before we leave Ukraine then, another bit of news is that Russia appears to have shot down one of its own aircraft. It's got a drone, its latest and its best, quite big as a plane. Don't know whether you know much about it, but there is footage and evidence to show that actually Russians shot this down on Ukraine, over Ukraine soil.
Yeah, it's quite a bizarre story. It sort of passed by pretty unnoticed, but the S-70, which is one of Russia's state-of-the-art stealthy drones, as you say, it's the size of a fighter jet, but it doesn't have a cockpit because it's got nobody in it, designed to operate closely with a Russian fighter jet, normally the Su-35. I think we've got a bit of a picture of it as well. Only 4 built, apparently
so far.
Designed in 2012, first flight in 2019, and it appears the British Ministry of Defence said that it looked like they'd lost control of the drone, and therefore the Russians shot it down to stop it falling into Ukrainian hands. Why would you be flying a brand new drone that hasn't got combat experience? Well, almost certainly because Russia's trying to use all of the weapons it has. You can imagine Putin going, "I've been investing in this thing for 14 years, get it out there." But when it was...
Give it a live test, you mean?
Yeah, live test, and then get it, let's see it in operation. We own the skies over Ukraine. But whatever the real story is here, the remains, there's some crash footage which we'll show as well. That will be sifted through forensically, not only by the Ukrainians.
Was it shot down by bullets or a missile or what?
By missile. The footage shows a little white streak as the missile goes off and takes it out.
And how far away from the drone would the fighter jet need to be to launch a missile?
So most missiles have a minimum range, because what you don't want when you fire a missile off a jet, it's got to go far enough away from the jet before it arms itself. Otherwise, it could blow up and take out the jet. So there's normally a minimum range. That's normally a quarter of a mile, half a mile away. Looking at the footage, it looks as if it's only about half to 3/4 of a mile away from the jet. And it's an easy shot because the drone is right in front of the Russian aircraft.
So Russian plane wasn't on over Ukraine.
The Russian plane was also over Ukraine.
Whoa.
But they're regularly over Ukraine. But it's interesting that...
But only just.
Well, but what's interesting is they're actually trailing. When you look at the video, they're actually trailing contrails. And that's a big no-no for military jets, because a jet is not that big. If you're operating at 30,000 feet, nobody can see you. They can probably just about hear you. So it's quite difficult to target you. If you're showing contrails, it's saying, I'm here. So every time at MetBrief in the morning, you listen to where the contrail levels are and you avoid those. On this particular occasion, it looks like that Russia just lost control, shut it down. So it's a very expensive and humiliating loss for Russia, demonstrating that the technology they're trying to bring in clearly didn't work.
So short, the USA has struggled to get influence over Israel. It's a dodgy time for the US, the election coming up in a couple of weeks. Hard to know whether their attempts are political for the election or whether it's truly based on humanitarian requirements, but they have struggled. Netanyahu doesn't seem to want to give in on a whole series of subjects and wants to do his own thing. However, that seems to have changed quite suddenly, quite recently. Can you tell us what's happened?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's been for the last year, the US have been calling for ceasefires. They've been trying to get more aid into Gaza. Netanyahu's done all sorts of things, but basically disregarded. There's lots of questions about what influence does America actually have. I spotted there was a complete sea change, though, because we're waiting for the attacks as we record. We're waiting for the attacks from Israel's retaliation against Iran. And one of the targets that Israel said they were considering was the nuclear capability of Iran. One of them was the energy infrastructure. Another one was military targets. And the US turned around and said, don't strike the nuclear facilities and don't strike the energy infrastructure, and continue getting more aid. For the first time I've seen in ages, Netanyahu came out and the Israeli government said, we're not going to strike the nuclear facilities and we're not going to strike the energy infrastructure. And 200 aid trucks went into northern Gaza. And I went, hang on a minute, for the last year they've largely been ignoring the US. What has changed? And I think from a military perspective, what's changed is that the US has made the decision to deploy this terminal high altitude air defense system, THAAD, I think it's called, into Israel. Why is that important? Because when Iran launched its wave of ballistic missiles, 180, Israel said, we protect ourselves, none got through. I beg to differ. There's lots of satellite imagery and you've seen lots of footage that shows that a lot of them did get through. Yeah. And that means that Israel's vulnerable.
Yeah.
The only defense they have against that is their atom missile system and the Patriot system of the US. They don't have enough. Therefore, they desperately need America's help to provide the extra level of defense that they need. So all of a sudden, Netanyahu was vulnerable. And as soon as he was vulnerable, the US had influence. And I don't think it's coincidence that that's why Netanyahu had made those concessions to the US request.
Well, I suppose the outcome is good, whatever the motive. You know my feelings about the motive, particularly with the election coming up. This is all politics, and they've only got time to do what looks good back home at the moment in America. Understandable, I don't particularly like it, but if the results are good, then I suppose that's okay.
Yeah, I think for me, there's an extra layer under this, though, that if you give Israel ultimate protection, how do you stop it from just going out and picking conflicts wherever it wants to go? Because it feels immune to attack.
Yeah, well, you have to keep doing deals, basically. There's a constant trade going on, and they found some leverage, some cards which they had.
But they haven't used it up to now. That's the point. They're the ultimate guarantor of security for Israel, been ploughing all this stuff in, and yet don't seem to have any influence at all.
Yeah, that's because they're probably stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to conclude that, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, they've got one of the closest international relationships on the planet, America and Israel. So you'd have thought they would have had loads on both sides to continuously negotiate between the issue of providing support doing the right thing from an energy point of view, which is clearly a political issue, and providing humanitarian support in whatever guises that might come in. So it is surprising, but maybe they haven't tried hard enough.
No, but I think, and the other worry is, you remember that the British government decided to stop some of the arms sales.
10%, yeah. David Lammy.
Posturing. Yeah, because you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are supporting or you're not.
Yeah, it was. I mean, who knows exactly, but the UK's response was about getting the votes from a certain part of the population of Great Britain. Are they stupid enough to be fooled by that, by David Lammy? No, I don't think so. And I actually think it failed, and it backfired.
No, but also there's the other bit about if you provide weapons to a country that uses those in disregard of international law, then you are now complicit in it. And I think for me, that was always the worry. So it doesn't stop you supplying weapons to Israel, but it does mean that they can't do what they like with those weapons. And I think one of the concerns is that you only have to look into the Gaza at the moment. The figures at the moment, I think we're over 42,000 killed.
Some of them Hamas.
Yeah, and
soldiers.
Yeah, and some of them were women and children. And there's been huge numbers of casualties, and of course the humanitarian situation in the country, and there's been lots of concern about, is this genuinely only about rooting out Hamas, or is this about creating an environment in Gaza that's unsustainable in the future? Because if Israel's long-term plan is a one-state solution, not a two-state solution, then forcing people out of those areas would be part of the plan.
Right, but Netanyahu has made it very clear in recent speeches what he would like in Gaza, which is the individuals without Hamas, with their non-terrorist leaders, to run the area, without the capacity to chuck bombs at them. Like, okay, it's been gone both ways. But I think Netanyahu has made that very clear recently. So I think I get confused with the one state, two state. I think it's so political, so hot as a term. I'm not even sure it's valid anymore, because it immediately sends people to either side of the equation.
Yeah, I'm with you, but I think we're not going too deeply into this because we'll end up getting pilloried from everybody.
We'll do that anyway.
Yeah, looking west towards Gaza, that's one thing. Looking east towards the West Bank is another. And over several years, a lot of what Israel's doing, even Israel admits, is against international law, of gradually squeezing some of the settlers out of that area. And that's going to create a difficult environment. That's my point.
It's totally difficult. And I think the West Bank is harder than Gaza. And the reason is the history, because the West Bank was historically Judah and Samaria, I think. I'll probably get that wrong, but I think that's the case. Now, the history of those two areas, regions, mini countries, goes back thousands of years in a way that the Gaza thing, doesn't. The Gaza situation is different from an Arab point of view as well. So, good luck for everybody trying to sort out the West Bank.
No, and I'd say, and it's just, I think all of this, though, people have just found it so difficult. So it stepped away and leave it up to the people on the ground. And that's just led to this cycle of violence, which has got pretty significant at the moment, and it won't solve the regional problems.
Yeah, we're probably talking about this more than we intended, but it goes back to something you said a few weeks ago about, Clinton at the table trying to fix the thing. I've got a sneaky feeling that America won't be able to fix this. It's a complex local issue. I'm slightly worried because I think, countries like Saudi Arabia need to be involved. What they've done recently in joining BRICS, the effect of that on the petrodollar relationship and new ways of thinking that may just push some of the local countries into different relationships, including Iran, who's a recent joiner of BRICS. So, that makes me feel a bit worried, maybe even suspicious about it. But I don't think America can play a role in the final solution. It's got to be done, locally.
No,
support.
I'm with you. And I think one of the things we're going to have to look at the fullness of time is we occasionally paint BRICS as this sort of alternative to the West, alternative to NATO, the alternative to, and what's fascinating is Turkey. You know, Turkey is a member of NATO, but it's also
Pointing east.
Yeah, pointing east. And, you know, BRICS is more a economic forum, you know, whereas NATO is more a defensive military alliance. So they should be separate. If we start to think of them otherwise, then maybe we misunderstand what NATO is all about. So yeah, I think it's an incredibly difficult situation.
Yeah. Okay, if we can stick with the conflict here and turn our attention to Hezbollah, they're getting funding. The suspicion, with some degree of evidence, is a lot of the funding is coming from Iran, and apparently. It's been claimed that there is a hospital in the Lebanon, and beneath it, how far beneath it, you know, it's hard to say, there is a lot of money, like, you know, $100, $200, $300 million, a big chunk of that in gold. That claim has been disputed. What's your feeling about it?
Part of this is all back to the bombing campaign in Beirut, isn't it? In the Lebanon, Israel's been hammering away at targets across Beirut. As we record last night, there were a whole load more targets. Most of these appear to be underground bunkers on the premise that Israel claims that Hezbollah has got a lot of underground tunnels in the same way as they've got in the Gaza. Most interesting about this particular story, though, was there's long been, how does Iran support Hezbollah? You've got to pay these fighters. And as you said before, most of them probably don't have a bank account. They give you a sort code and account number and have a direct debit. So a lot of it's got to be in cash. And therefore, how does Iran provide cash? And there's been all sorts of reports about suitcases laden with cash and gold and that sort of thing moving across to help pay. And the story seems to be about Israel claiming that there was a bunker full of this gold and money. Well, it's not entirely clear to me why you'd bomb it, but you know that's a strategy. But what's fascinating is then the Lebanese turning around and saying, there was nothing there. Come and have a look around.
Yeah.
And showcasing, which you've had a look at as well, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, so the BBC were invited in. Let's come back to that in a second.
Level -2 in the Al Sahel hospital. The area just behind me is where medical waste is stored. Even that was opened up for us to have a look. The morgue was opened up. All of the drawers were opened to show us there was nothing inside. Doctors have been opening piles of surgical scrubs, boxes of equipment, very, very keen to show us everything there is to see and to prove that there is nothing here. Well, I'm just...
Clearly, based on what you said, there is going to be a lot of cash required on a continuous basis. This is a very big army, substantial army. The cost of that army from a personal point of view is going to be very high and regular. So you're going to need old-fashioned hoards of cash, maybe even gold. So it's got to be somewhere. You know, it wouldn't be a couple of pounds in every house in Lebanon. There's going to be vaults with it in, whether it's under that hospital or another one or somewhere else, I don't know, but it's going to exist. So the idea that people are saying it's not there is just completely stupid. If it's not there, it's somewhere else. Secondly, how stupid of the BBC to allow themselves to go in, have this journalist walking around level 2, then level 1, then the ground floor, and to say, look, they've allowed us in. Guess what? There's nothing there. How stupid. I'm not sure that plays well for the BBC.
No, and I know...
Involved in it's kind of propaganda game.
We can sometimes be a bit critical of the BBC, and at my heart, I'm a backer of having an independent, publicly financed broadcaster. But that clip, money is largely transportable by its very definition. It's in a form that you can easily hand between people. what does it prove that you've lifted all the money out if it had been there?
They invite the cameras in.
And invite the cameras in.
Yeah.
And now the cameras are now being part of the propaganda machine.
Yeah.
And does it prove that there wasn't money there before? No.
It was the other way. When the IDF claimed they found hordes of guns and ammunition and weapons in people's homes, and they showed pictures of it, our first reaction is, well, okay, just pause for a second before you go along with it, because there's loads of other explanations,
Yeah.
and this is war.
No, it's also, and I think one of the things people tend to forget is we've all seen these big films of heists with bank vaults with massive amounts of money and gold in it. And when we hear about the sort of sums of money involved with 50 million, 100 million, we imagine it's a vault and therefore difficult to move that sum of money around. We should do the maths one day, but my understanding is that actually in a relatively modest size suitcase, you can get $1 million easily.
I'll bring in 10 million.
And it's not a big...
One of our podcasts, I'll show you.
Yeah, it's not a big quantity.
No.
And therefore it's really easy to move it around.
Yeah.
Because it probably isn't going to be stacked up in the corner. It's probably going to be in a suitcase.
One lorry.
Pick them up, move them out. It's not easy, not difficult to move that stuff around.
Yeah.
And gold, what's the price of gold going through the roof at the moment per ounce? You still do the maths around that. You don't need a lot of it to have a huge... So it's easily moved around. I lament slightly at the BBC being used for that, because I'm a supporter of the BBC traditionally, but
What should they fall for, should they?
No.
Before we move on to the next one, you used to move them out. It's a very evocative phrase. Do you know where it comes from? An old TV program.
Is that the Cowboy series? Moving the cattle out.
Yes, but what was it called?
Rawhide.
Well done. Which famous actor was in it?
No.
Clint Eastwood.
Oh, there we go. I was thinking the other one.
Yeah.
It was the massive bloke who used to do a lot of the gun stuff. He was called John Wayne.
Oh,
John Wayne.
I thought you were talking about Hoss Cartwright.
No, John Wayne. And he wasn't actually called John, was he? He was called somebody else.
Yeah, like Emily or something.
Emily or Francis or something. And,
Yeah.
Anyway, how do we get onto that?
Yes, I don't know. Something you said, obviously. Apparently, classified documents have been leaked in the US, and these plans are purported to be Israel's retaliation plans against Iran.
This was a fascinating...
This is tough, yeah?
Yeah, it is an interesting story, because this bloke, I was actually in Sky the day this broke, and I was asked to talk about it. I went, hang on a minute, what do we actually know about this? What we think we know is that there were two highly classified documents, as you say, that were talking about Israel's responses to go against Iran. And they apparently appeared on the Telegram social media channel. So somehow it got leaked. But were they actually proper documents? And if they were, how were they leaked? Because there are all sorts of reasons why Iran might want to put false documents out there, which would derail Israel's plan, because it might be that these weren't the plans at all and America wasn't aware of them, and America would be really hacked off that Israel was planning to do something that they hadn't supported. So Iran would be going hee behind closed doors. Right. It might well have been that America had released them because it wanted to undermine Iran and stop it doing so. There's so many conspiracy theories around this. One I thought was fascinating, though, getting to the nub of it, the FBI, I think it was the FBI involved. Turned around and actually said, we're trying to get to the bottom of the leak.
Yeah.
In other words, they didn't turn around and say, these aren't legitimate classified documents. Implicitly, they were saying they were classified documents. We're now trying to work out how on earth they got out into the public domain. And I think that's fascinating because of every time we talk about the Israel conflict, it polarizes, doesn't it? And even in America, it polarizes. You might be in the Pentagon, you might be at the highest levels of defense, but it's people. And each of those people have their own belief system. And if one of those people decides that, actually, I don't like the way this is going, I'm going to leak it, that's quite possible. Now, they'd be out of a job, there'd be all sorts of issues that they'll be dealt with.
I think somebody's actually been fingered. I'm not going to get into who it might have been. That would be dangerous. But I think I read that somebody's been fingered. Now, of course, everybody can create a scapegoat when they need it. The final thing for me on this, is, which you sort of touched on, if it's true, then of course it does give evidence of the fact that detailed plans like this, which are sort of very inflammatory, do find their way from Israel to America for possibly good reasons in terms of their relationship.
Well, it is worth remembering. You talked earlier about that one of the closest relationships is between Israel and America. We tend to see the tip of the iceberg, which is the bombs going over there and the trade underwater, below, away from our sight. The intelligence that gets shared, the satellite imagery, the very sensitive information that gets shared. I'm not aware of the level, but that's part of what a relationship is about. And there will be, I have no doubt, America has got better intelligence about some aspects of Iranian nuclear capability, Iranian's military capability and its energy. And therefore, if Israel was going to do some form of strike, it's no doubt that America would be complicit in that, whether helping or aiding or assisting, whatever.
Or sharing intelligence, all sorts.
Yeah,
quite.
That's going to be happening.
Yeah. Okay, another subject which caught my eye recently, it's sort of an unusual one for us, but a young lady called Cheryl Golan committed suicide. She was enjoying her time at the Nova Festival, saw a lot of bad things, escaped with her life, but probably due to the lasting effects of that, PTSD or something, she took her life a few days ago. And for reasons which are quite hard to explain, I found it really sad that somebody who, in a sense, wasn't part of all this has lost her life. Now, you can come back at me with a lot of challenges to how I felt, which I'm prepared to discuss. But it was very sad to see it. Now, it's one life in many, but nonetheless, it was a life.
Yeah, this story has so many connotations for me. I spent 2 years of my life in the conflict of Afghanistan, and I wouldn't try to compare my experience to our soldiers on the ground in Lashkar and who tragically lost their lives or limbs or whatever. But many of them suffer from PTSD. Many people involved in conflict over the years, back to the Second World War, back to the First World War. But I do some work with veterans, and they didn't call it PTSD.
Shell shock.
Yeah, but you just man up and get on with it. We've become better at understanding it now, but tragically, the number of people in this country, number of soldiers who end up on the streets, who have some form of PTSD, but we don't look after them. And I think this is just a tragic example that different experiences affect different people in different ways. You can't be judgmental about it. I saw it, I was fine, why aren't you?
Yeah, quite.
It's not like
it's
that.
Very personal, yeah.
I think the two things that were interesting about this story for me, well, one of which was one of the relations, I think it was the father, was blaming the Israeli state for not doing more. I can imagine the anger and the frustrations as a parent myself about, but where is the line between the family's responsibility and the state's responsibility? Really difficult one. And the other angle was that we tend to see this conflict through the lens of Israel, and this is a tragic case of the wider impact of the atrocious acts on the 7th of October. But just a bit further west, there are a lot of people who've lost their lives. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of people who've lost their homes, injuries, whatever. The traumatic pictures of young kids particularly covered in dust and blood that have seen their families die, have watched their communities. What impact is all this going to have on them, and what treatment, what help, what support are any of those going to get?
Yeah. I mean, that's where I ended up, funny enough, because I was sort of challenging myself why did I feel so emotional. And what it boiled down to for me was, whether it's 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, in the end, it boils down to person, a child, a mother who's lost her husband, a mother who's lost a child who's lost their parents. And that's, for me, where the hurt and the pain really is. Irrespective of how many ultimately been associated with it. And I think that's why I couldn't help myself feeling so bad about this one, even though it was just one against, you stand back, many in the end. For me, it's all about the one and the effect for them and the effect on those around them.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I do think it throws a spotlight on something we probably don't think about that much, that we deal with casualties, we discuss the numbers of dead, we discuss the number of injured, we discuss the number of people who are technically starving, the number of people lost. It's all very objective, it's all scientific. The human part of this is very difficult to measure in the same way, and it manifests itself in very different ways. But conflict, in whatever form it takes, leaves this trail, this legacy, which may not be easily seen.
And will last a long time.
Last a lifetime.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Very sad. Another individual, Sean, who's lost his life, is the very famous or infamous Yahya Sinwar. So I've got so many questions on this, we haven't got time. Obviously, the first question is, was it really him? The second one will be, so what actually is the impact?
Yeah, so was it really him is definitely one that's been bouncing around, because the conspiracy theorists say, Israel's just claimed they've seized a head. I think we can knock that one on the head pretty quickly. So Israel, if they hadn't got Yahya Sinwar but claimed they had, if you were Yahya Sinwar and that's what you read, you would pop up somewhere and go,
yeah,
here I am, massively undermined. So one of the things that Israel, they had him, but they weren't sure they got him. So it was about 24 hours before they actually said, we've got him. And part of that was apparently taking DNA. Because Yahya Sinwar had been locked up in prison in Israel.
Oh, well, he was amongst a lot of prisoners who got exchanged for one, was it an IDF soldier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who'd been locked up for 5 years. Over 1,000 prisoners were exchanged for that one soldier. Yahya Sinwar was one of those. I think he was serving 4 life sentences at the time. So they had his DNA. So the point was, they could therefore go back and go, we need to be sure about this. 24 hours later, they'd done right, we've now got him. Now they've gone out public and said, we've got him. And I think Israel would be horribly naive and stupid to claim that if they weren't absolutely sure, because that would bounce back and hurt them. Yeah. It would in this days of social media, it would bounce back.
Yeah, so let's assume then it's him.
Yeah, so the question then is, what impact? I mean, the trouble is all these organisations are hydras, aren't they? That you chop off one head and another one grows back.
Yeah.
So Hamas would have you believe it doesn't matter. We've got 100 people, 1,000 people ready to step into his shoes. That might be true, but my experience, and probably yours as the head of an organisation, there is a role for looking down into the organisation, and there's a role for looking up and engaging. And generally the top of the organisation looks up and out, and you have henchmen who do the bottom and down. Yahya Sinwar was at the top, so his relations would be international. They would be with Iran, they would be with lots of other nations. Those relations will be heavily protected. You can't replace those easily. You can't take a guy who was a henchman and suddenly put him in a suit and he's now got to do the diplomacy side. Yahya Sinwar has been doing that for a long time, and that is the bit that will hurt them. It isn't the fact of having a figurehead, wear a badge, I'm now head of Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say something positive about somebody that's maybe not too pleasant, but to be the head of an organisation, of any organisation, having some charisma is also required, because you need people to follow you. You need people who, when you say, follow me, go over the top, or whatever it is, people are going to follow you. That's quite hard to replace as well. But I think your comment about the network and the years it takes to build those trusted relationships up, so you can have important conversations and negotiations and trading and sharing with others who are not part of your own clan. that's tough to replace.
It's also so difficult. By all accounts, Yahya Sinwar was quite intimidating. He was quite ruthless.
Yeah.
If you're a deputy, it's quite difficult to be ruthless because you may not be speaking with your master's voice.
Yeah.
But the master can be afford to be very ruthless. And so how do you get the next generation that have that same confidence to do that? So it's an important step. I think Benjamin Netanyahu said it was the beginning of the end, not the end. But the very fact that they continued fighting, for me, it left the question, what is your metric of success, Israel? When are you going to stop fighting? Is it when the last round comes out from Gaza? In which case, I think you could be fighting for a long time.
People who have wondered how you actually take out a building in war, an individual building. And the image here is very clear that a missile, incoming missile, hits the ground floor or the ground around and just very spectacularly brings the whole thing down in a mess of dust and bricks.
One of the things that, so I was a weapons instructor when I was in the military, and you used to do weapons to target matching. So people imagine it's just £1,000 bomb flying towards a target. There's so much more to it than that. First of all, how big a charge do you need? If you're only going against a small target and don't want to have too much collateral damage, you might use a relatively small bomb. If you don't care so much about that, you might have a larger bomb. Second one is, how are you going to guide it to the target? I know it sounds obvious, but if you're trying to hit a target there and you throw a bomb unguided, it follows a parabolic curve. But you might want it to come straight down on top of the building. You might want it to come in at the side of the building. And therefore, you need to program that into the flight plan of the guidance system for the bomb. And the third thing you want is that we traditionally expect bombs to go off when they hit a target. You might want it to go off just above the target, do what's called an airburst. You might want it to impact and go. You might want it to go quite a way into the building, because if I want to hit the third floor of a building, for example, there are lots of complex calculations you can do based on how the building is built, that you can work out what time delay you want on that explosive, so you know what speed it's going to hit, you know how it'll slow down, and therefore you want it to blow up at its precisely. So you set a time delay on the fuse. All of that is a complex.
Yeah.
So when you take a bomb, and if your objective is to collapse a building, you'll look at the structure of that building and you'll work out what you need to do to take it down.
Yeah.
Now,
interesting. Yeah.
Away from that, sometimes it can just be chance. It can be that because some of these buildings aren't built that well, that you take out a couple of supports, it should really stand, but actually that's enough for it to go and just fall in. But the weapons to target matching for weapons that the Israelis have high-end weapons, there's a massive science. It takes a lot of time, but it is absolutely a science behind that.
Once you hit a building somewhere, and of course they don't particularly want to leave this to chance, but once you hit a building somewhere, the weight, and you sort of dislodge the support, the weight above that point is going to bring it down anyway, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe. That's with the Twin Towers.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. So, for example, if you want to take it a bridge, most people imagine you want to hit the bridge, but the trouble is the bridge is designed to take weight that way. So if you push it down, it doesn't generally give way easily. If you can somehow take the supports out and blow the bridge up, it moves up and then it just collapses because it's not used to doing that. So sometimes the shock waves will move a building up very slightly.
Okay.
And then when it comes back down again, it collapses.
Yeah. Because
the momentum of the floors, some of it gets stopped, but the floors are now moving down.
Yeah.
So it's so people, we imagine from films and everything like that, it's just bombs going off everywhere. There's a lot more science to it these days.